Alright, in this video we are going to continue where we left off and start to style our header. So let's move back to VS Code and the brief. And we already have the markup structure. There are a few styling related bits in these different pages, but we're mostly going to be working out of this page, which has all the dimensions that we'll need. And I will start roughly going from top to bottom, although there may be some places where I jump out of order. I'm really going to be putting it together in kind of the way that I would approach it, not literally going step by step. And that's the way you won't have step by step in order instructions for creating this sort of task. It's just not really the way that it's done. You'll have in the field you'll have design documents, and you'll have to uh, look at them, understand them, and translate them into a web page. And it won't be PDF briefs that you'll be using. You'll be using a different tool, and you'll start to learn that different tool soon. But um, okay, well, that's enough of a preamble. So, starting from top to bottom, what do we need? Well, we need this space here, 30 pixels up top. For that, I'm going to use padding on the header. And to see why, let's see, we can go here, and let's open up the developer tools. And I'll get this, try to get it set. There we are, 1440 pixels. Take a look here. I'll select the header and watch what happens if I give it padding. And I'm just going to give it the values that it's eventually going to have. 30 pixels on the top, 80 pixels left and right, 40 pixels bottom. Now if we select it, see how that just kind of frames it? That we're following the box model here. So the box model, the padding is inside the element. So if you want to produce space between a parent element and its children, which is exactly what we're doing here, you should probably use padding. Now, there are definitely cases where this is not true. In fact, in your next project, and in a lot of projects, you won't use side padding. There's a good chance, or you might use a small amount of side padding, but you'll also use margin to center the content. So there are lots of exceptions, but it's a pretty decent general rule to follow. And so this is the first style that we're going to apply, and we're going to apply it to the header. We go full screen with VS Code and open the style sheet. Padding. You may recall that we saw that we should have a background color of FFF and also a background image. Background image. Now, for here, we can just use VS Code again, but we can't use dot slash. If we do dot slash, nothing appears. Is VS Code broken? No, it's not. What appears when you start typing a file path is what is available to you. And there's nothing else in here because it's looking in the current directory, the pages directory. And the current file is the only thing in it. So there's nothing to display. So if we do dot dot slash, now it takes us to the parent directory, which is the project's root directory. And from there, we can go into the images directory and choose the appropriately named background image. Now, if we go back to Chrome, the background image doesn't necessarily look right, but we're not going to worry about that yet because we want to have mostly everything else in place before we bother to try to get it looking correct. So with that, we can move on to trying to style the nav. And let's just go back to the brief for a moment to see. So we've got this part, the top, so we can move on to the nav. Just going top to bottom. First, for the overall layout, how do we make it so that the logo is over here and this stuff is over there? Think about it. See what you can come up with. And so now unpause the video, and hopefully you thought that maybe you could use Flexbox for that, and that is something that you should definitely keep close in your mind. That anytime you want to take stuff that is in a column and make it a row, well, Flexbox is probably a good choice. How do we do it? You give display flex to the parent. That's what turns it into a row. You might look at this and say, well, that's not a row. These are all in a column. But the elements inside the flex container are in a row. And you can see it by hovering over the nav, which we have turned into a flex container by giving it display flex. And you see how on the left of it, there are two highlighted blue boxes. They're separated by like a dashed line. Those are the elements inside the nav. There's only two of them. The logo and that group of stuff. And they are indeed in a row. They're just clustered all on the left. To make them not clustered on the left, well, what can we do? If you don't remember, this can be helpful. Or could be helpful, perhaps. Like, you can look through here and see, well, this looks kind of like what we want to do, right? We want to take stuff and put it on the left, and then other stuff and put it on the right. There we are. Justify content space between. This is definitely one of the more common properties that you will use. Justify content space between and justify content center are perhaps the most common justifying values. So let's add that to nav. Okay, this is good. Now, see what you can do with this. Let's at least try to get, maybe don't worry about the font so much, but try to remove the dots, because we don't want them, and get these arranged in a row. And also, if we look at the brief, we see that there should be 20 pixels in between each of these elements. So see if you can do that too. And then unpause the video, and I will walk you through it. Okay, so we need to turn this group of elements from a column into a row. We literally just saw how to do that with the nav. With the nav, we turned it into a row by giving the nav display flex. To turn the elements inside the nav links into a row, we give nav links display flex. We don't need to justify the content at all, I don't think. The default should be fine. But we do want 20 pixels in between each of them. So we can use gap for that. That's exactly what gap is for. It produces space between flex items, so the elements inside a flex container, and not around them. So there won't be any space between the flex container and its children. Back to VS Code, and let's remove the dots with list style type none. Okay, pretty good. Now, I want to point one other thing out, though. Take a close look. Compare this, what's being highlighted, with what the brief shows. And note that the distance between the tops of these elements is supposed to be 30. And that's the same as here. But here, their tops are not even. Like the top of this element is more than 30 pixels from the top of the header. And the reason can also be seen and it can be seen by hovering over the navlinks element. It's the margins. We should actually remove the top and bottom margin and this left padding. The left padding might not be causing any issues at the moment, but it's still always better to just remove the default styles. Either set them to 0 or some other appropriate value based on the needs of the project. In this case, we set them to 0. And changes are pretty minimal, but you can see that it is now lined up with the top of this. And I'm going to leave the text styles as an exercise for you. And let me go back here. You can fill in the blanks with the text styles on the nav link element. You'll need to, what will you need to do? Reset underline, the text underline, and you'll need to remove underline, remove the underline, change color. That might be about it. There might be some more things, but I'll add that there for you. Okay. Moving on to the rest of the header. Back to the brief. Let's get the margins in place. Well, no, let's absolutely position this because everything's going to be wonky until we absolutely position it. That will pull it out of the flow of the document so that all other elements ignore it. We need to make it 124 pixels from the top and 5 pixels from the right. And we need to give it these dimensions. Give it a try, then unpause the video, and I'll show you how. All right. The element is header image. I'm going to do it right here. Header __ image. We need position absolute. We need top of positive 124 pixels because the positive values bring you in from the corresponding side. So 124 brings you 124 pixels down from the top. And then the width, 646 by the height, which was 568. And if you ever forget which goes which, like is 646 height or is it width? I'm always forgetting that, to be honest. I will look, if it's not obvious to me, I'll look at another element where it is obvious. Here, it's obvious that the 105 is the width. So therefore, I will assume that this is the width of the image element because presumably the designer is more consistent than my brain is with that. Back to Chrome. Look at that. And you see how now this image is cut off. Why would that be? Think about it. The reason was hinted at by something I said a little while ago. And so the reason is that we pulled this out of the flow of the document. So all other elements ignore it, including its... And one thing that means is that the parent element also ignores it, pretends like it's not there. So there's no need for the parent element, the header, to be big enough to fit this. It just ignores it. Before we move on, though, let's take a look at another thing. Watch what happens. See how this is moving outside of the bounds? Well, also these are moving outside the bounds. That might be, I think that's a separate issue. But if we go out to like a really wide screen, you see this just keeps on scrolling out there. Why is that? Well, the reason is, let me refresh the page. I've got some inline styles there. The reason is we forgot to add position relative to the parent element. And adding position relative to the parent element is what anchors an absolutely positioned element inside of it. Without that, it's just going to be positioned with respect to the view window, which is, you know, which is big. So position relative needs to go there. And, nope, not there. Here. And this is not mentioned in the brief. This is just something that you need to know. Eventually you'll remember it. And it doesn't really count as relatively positioning this element. Relatively positioning elements is something slightly different, and actually I guess we'll move on to that now. So this is a usage of relative position, yes, but it's not really positioning that element relatively. Positioning an element relatively we will do with the nav logo element, and we'll show that as an example of how that works. Back to the brief. Note first we need 105 by 39, the dimensions. But then also note that the 80 pixels padding is not going to work for us here. It needs to be only 30 pixels from the side. One way that we could do it is with position relative, and that's what we're going to do. Let's go to VS Code first and add the width and the height. I think those are right. And add position relative. And now, back to the browser. Let me reframe this. Select this element. It's 80 from the left now. We want to shift it over so that it's only 30 from the left. And that means we need to shift it 50 pixels. To do that with position relative, we can give it a, let's see, left negative 50. Because remember, if we gave it positive 50, that would move it 50 pixels to the right. So that's that. But now take a look. If we hover back over here, the parent element is still acting as if the logo was where it originally was placed. That is how position relative, or one of the ways that position relative differs from position absolute. The element is not pulled out of the flow of the document, and all other elements act as if it was where it initially began. And so this gives, for this reason, position relative, using it in this way, it's fairly limited. You don't want to use it a whole lot because it can really make things tricky if you're using a lot of relative position, especially if you're using large values where you're really shifting an element far across the page. Because other elements will behave as if it was in its original position, and it can be very difficult to figure out what's going on when you do that. In this case, it's a small adjustment, so it's not going to be too confusing for us. So left negative 50. Back to the brief. Margins. 183 pixels between the logo and this element. 28 pixels between these two text elements. And then nothing is marked here. Okay. So let's go to the browser, and how can we do this? Well, one thing you need to keep in mind is that there are these default margins that we need to take into consideration. So I think it would be fairly common for students to go, well, we'll do margin top 128, then margin top 28, And then we're done, right? But no, we're not really done. And you see how there's this extra margin here, there's an extra margin down there on the bottom, and those can be problematic. So you should set those to 0. As we discussed up here, you want to not have default margins in place. So back to VS Code, and we will do header, title, margin 128 on the top. No, it was 183. I did that wrong in my example, but whatever. 183 on top, and then 0 everywhere else. Header description, margin 28 on top, 0 everywhere else. The difference is not really noticeable in this case, but it's still important to keep in mind. But then what about the distance between these elements? How are we going to create that? Well, before we do that, let's note that we're supposed to set the height of the header to 800 pixels. And until we have the header being 800 pixels, we're not really going to be able to do what we need to do here. You could guess at the distance and give an explicit margin. So, like for instance, if we did header footer, margin top 150 pixels, then we go back to Chrome, and maybe we need to add a little bit more, so we could increase it, and we could make it look about right. But that's not the way to do it. Instead, we should set that height for the header that we're told, 800 pixels, and use margin top auto. Margin top auto. Now, I think it's not actually going to work yet. So let's go back. Okay, yeah, it's not working yet. But you see now the header is 80 well, it's actually 870 because of the margins, the padding on the top and bottom. But the header is bigger, but this is still where it was before, even though we gave it margin top auto. And possibly you remember this because you encountered it in the staff picks section in the previous project, in the cards. To use margin top auto or margin bottom auto, you need to be in a flex container. It's just one of those things. You can use margin left and right auto anywhere, but margin top and bottom auto, you need to be in a flex container, meaning the parent of the header footer has to be a flex container, meaning the header has to be a flex container. Now, if we just set display to flex, oops, everything broke. Because we still need the column direction. We need flex direction column. There we are. Getting closer. Now, yes, there's still issues with the text here, but I want to get a few things in order here to have the basic configuration right. Because yeah, this doesn't look correct, but the configuration is correct. We have text element A on top of text element B. Ignore the fact that this is not correct yet. And they are to the left of image. So that's good. Let's move on to here. How can we arrange this according to the brief? Try and figure that out, and try and make sure that the spacing between all the elements, vertical and horizontal, is correct. See if you can figure it out. And then I'll pause the video and I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so I'll do it here so you can see what's going on. Here's the header footer element. It has two elements inside it. The div that contains that stuff and the paragraph tag. As we've done twice already in this project stage, if we turn it into a flex box, now those two elements are in a row. As we did with the nav block, if we want to produce space between them, we can just use maximal space. We can use justify content space between. Now, I mentioned paying attention to the vertical and horizontal distances between elements. There shouldn't be these spaces. Just look at the picture. You'll see they're not there. How do we get rid of them? This is something that we've already encountered again twice in this project stage so far in this video. The default margins that are on all paragraph elements, heading elements, and list elements. They should be removed either by setting them to 0 or some other appropriate value. In this case, there's no appropriate value. We just need to set it to 0, and it should be set on the class, not just on the individual element. So we're going to have to go to VS Code to do that. So let's do it. Header footer, display flex, justify content space between, header paragraph, margin 0. Are we done? Well, no, there is one more thing. There's one more thing pertaining to the vertical alignment of these elements. Look carefully at the brief. This address is aligned with the bottommost of the text elements on the left. To do this, we can't use justify content because that handles justifying elements along the main axis. We need to, which in this case is a row. What we need to do is align all the elements to the bottom of the container, right? To the bottom of this container. And to do that, we can just give, oops, wrong element, align items, flex end to the header footer. Align items, flex end. And that's it. So back to VS Code. Align items, flex end. Okay, so we are getting pretty close. It's basically just what remains. It's text styles. Is this the right dimension? It looks wrong, but I think that might just be, yeah, it's correct, the 183. It looks wrong because of the text being wrong. So there are some text related things that we still need to handle, and we'll do that in a separate video. And there's also this this background image thing. So we'll handle let's do the background image now, and then we'll work on the text later. So for the background image, we're given some instructions here. First page. Background cover doesn't repeat and its position is centered. Set the size value to cover. So we're actually basically told what to do. We could figure it out though. Setting repeat to no repeat is a very common first step. And you can kind of see how it looks like it's repeating itself. In this case, it might not be all completely obvious that that's what's going on here. Sometimes it's much more obvious that a background is repeating itself. But what we can just do is set background repeat to no repeat. And, well, that looks pretty good, but still, now it looks closer, but it's still not right, you know, because this part's not covered. Well, that we can change the background size. So here is probably where we need to use, background size cover. And there was another, it said it's positioned in the center. I don't think we actually need to do that because that should be the default here. This looks pretty correct. Let's compare it. Yeah, that looks correct. So I believe it's just those two styles that we should do. And those go on the header. We could do, well, let's do it like this. Background repeat, no repeat, and background size cover. Now, we could also use a shorthand syntax. So instead of, I'm thinking background repeat you might not be able to use it in the shorthand. I'm not certain. But you can use the background shorthand, and the syntax for it is a little bit tricky because it's not entirely consistent, it seems. Oh yeah, you can use no repeat. The order, I think, doesn't matter. But one thing that is a common gotcha is that the position and the size go like this. I'm not sure if you can separate them, so we'll need to specify center, even though it's the default, and cover. And then we can put the URL, then we can put the color, and then we can just use this background property instead of all those other property values that we've got. So let's try and put that all together. First, center / cover. No commas. You see there's no commas. Note the spaces here. I don't know if that's required, but I'm going to go with it. So center / cover, no dash repeat. FFF, and then the URL with the background image. We got that, and let's just verify that it still looks correct. Refresh the page to make sure. Yep. So looks like I did it correctly. Okay, so now with that, we are going to stop this video, and in the next video, I'll show you how to get this set up, and that'll be it for the header, basically.